Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take this video to talk about the claims of a biologist named Rupert Sheldrake, and I'm going to focus on Sheldrake's claims. Now, Sheldrake has recently, in the past decade or so, become famous for a particular view that he supports called morphic resonance, which has been deemed pseudoscientific by the biological community as a whole. We're going to be listening to some claims that Sheldrake's made about the nature of science, and specifically this idea of scientific dogma and how dogmatic thinking has held science back. We're going to be looking at Sheldrake's claims, not necessarily about morphic resonance, but about this idea that prior philosophical commitments of science is holding the scientific enterprise back or holding scientific progress back, or that this idea is, or that certain commitments that science has as an institution, as a discipline, are preventing other types of scientific ideas from gaining reputation. What's motivating this is Sheldrake's commitment to this understanding of morphic resonance. But we're going to watch some selections from some lectures that Sheldrake's gave, and also some videos that he's posted on his channel. But one is from a TED Talk that he gave that later became not redacted, but became one of the banned TED Talks, and it's banned because the TED Talk was given before Sheldrake supported this idea of morphic resonance, and they kind of wanted to preface the video by saying that these ideas are or have now been deemed pseudoscientific. But I want to analyze this idea in general of scientific dogma, and to analyze Sheldrake's claims specifically that a commitment to materialism is holding back scientific progress, or holding back, preventing certain theories from gaining traction. So let's go ahead and jump into it.
The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very widespread belief in our society. It's the kind of belief system of people who say, "I don't believe in God, I believe in science." It's a belief system which has now been spread to the entire world. But there's a conflict in the heart of science between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or a worldview. And unfortunately, the worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the very lifeblood of the scientific endeavor.
So Sheldrake starts off with this idea that there's what he calls the scientific worldview, is this kind of set of philosophical assumptions that people claim to derive from science. Now, he'll later identify this as materialism. Other philosophers of science might call this a form of scientism. This is the belief that you kind of have two general views here. One is the view that this gets into the nature of what is the scope of science, what sort of phenomenon is science trying to describe. And the idea of scientism is that science tells us about the world, but also that science is a description of all that there is. And what falls outside of the realm of science is, if we're going to take like a 20th century logical positivist view, is not, is kind of superficial fluff language. But the crux of what Sheldrake's saying here is that these sorts of commitments that may or may not be derived from the science itself is holding back what ought to be a sort of free examination of nature and a positing of hypothesis that is not limited to our like preconceived notions. And the biggest example of this that Sheldrake is going to point to say, like, this is what I'm talking about, is a commitment to what he identifies as materialism, and the belief that this commitment to materialism is what is holding science back. So I'm going to show another clip here and then kind of jump back into it.
Science has been conducted under the aspect of a belief system or worldview, which is essentially that of materialism. philosophical materialism. And these sciences are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the materialist worldview. I think that as we break out of it, the sciences will be regenerated.
So Sheldrake believes that this commitment to materialism hinders certain types of scientific ideas. And of course, this is a personal thing for Sheldrake because his own idea of morphic resonance goes against the materialistic grain, and as a result, he believes has hindered people, has prevented people from accepting it. I'm not going to go a whole lot into what morphic resonance is because I'm not a biologist and I frankly don't really understand it. But just to illustrate what I'm saying here, this comes from a book that Sheldrake wrote called Morphic Resonance. And this is a quote from an article that he wrote about the book. But Sheldrake, according to Sheldrake, morphic resonance is a process whereby self-organizing systems inherit a memory from previous similar systems. Memory need not be stored in material traces inside brains, which are more like TV receivers than video recorders, tuning into influences from the past. Thus, each individual inherits a collective memory from past members of the species and also contributes to the collective memory affecting other members of the species in the future. So this theory that Sheldrake proposes is anti-materialistic in the sense, well, we have a couple of things happening here. One is this idea that memory is not a purely biological process, meaning that memory is not something that's strictly limited to thinking organisms like brains. For one, Sheldrake will apply this idea to like the formation of crystals. So even material that we do not consider conscious, such as rocks, for lack of the scientific word, for Sheldrake contain some form of memory. So this idea of consciousness becomes, instead of an emergent property of the brain, becomes a fundamental feature of matter itself. So consciousness, this immaterial substance, is built into the very fabric of reality, which allows, in Sheldrake's position, for the transfer of memory. And there's also this idea that memory, it transcends the bodily limitations that we normally think of it as. So it's anti-materialistic. Mostly, I would say I would say that that Sheldrake's committed himself to a version of like a philosophical position called panpsychism, which is the belief that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, and that the standard scientific view, or the standard view of the materialist position, is that reality is fundamentally comprised of matter, inert, unconscious matter. But the panpsychists will claim that consciousness, alongside of the physical stuff that we normally think of, is a fundamental part of reality. So Sheldrake is saying that this theory, because of its anti-materialistic stance, because it proposes this idea of the fundamental feature of consciousness, was rejected because it disagreed with this sort of scientific dogma. Now let's look into how exactly Sheldrake understands this concept of materialism. This next video, Sheldrake on his own YouTube channel has a series of videos kind of furthering this idea and raising these basic questions about the nature of materialism. This comes from a two-part video. They're very short. They're just like 3 minutes a pop, called Questions for Materialist. I want us to watch this together so that way we can kind of get a better understanding of what exactly Sheldrake means by materialism.
Most of these have been part of science for a long time, some since the 17th century, when modern science as we know it first began. And one of the first steps in the development of modern science was the mechanistic theory of nature, the idea that nature is nothing but a machine, mechanical, purposeless, working in accordance with mathematical laws, and completely unconscious. This is a fundamental assumption of the current materialist and mechanistic worldview. And this is the first of the assumptions I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion. At the end of each chapter in that book, I have 4 questions for materialists. If you're a materialist yourself, or if you have friends who are materialists, these are genuine questions, and they can start discussions or debates, which is what I hope they'll do. And the 2 questions I want to ask now are, is the mechanistic worldview a testable scientific theory or a metaphor? Secondly, if it's a metaphor, why is the machine metaphor better in every respect than the organism metaphor? If it is a scientific theory, how could it be tested or refuted?
So Sheldrake here kind of paints this general picture of the history of science. And like most of these ideas and in most of these conversations, I don't disagree with how he's framing this like outright. I mean, there are parts of his description, and he goes more into this in the book that he writes. There are parts of this description that I would generally agree with. And for the most part, he's kind of right about this mechanistic universe that was proposed, especially in early modern science. So we're talking about the period of time starting with Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, kind of building up to Newton. This picture of science, dominated by the developments of early physics, led to this view of the what's called like the clockwork universe. Analogies to clocks, comparing the universe to a clock, or comparing biological organisms to watches, or to clocks, to mechanical objects, were super common during this period. There's actually a great history book about the early Enlightenment called The Clockwork Universe that goes into a lot of these scientific ideas and the analogies used. So he's not really wrong about that sort of characterization. What he's claiming about this characterization is that this analogy, this kind of framing of the universe, that the universe operates in clock-like fashion, can be misleading. And again, I also don't completely disagree with that. There's an element, there's a kernel of truth there that I kind of want to dive into a little bit. And Sheldrake's not the first to say this, but let's start off real quick. So what exactly do we mean by materialism within philosophy? This comes from the Rutledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Materialism is the ontological theory that is a theory about the kind of things that exist, or what exist. It's an answer to the question of metaphysics. In its simplest form, it can be understood to be making one claim that has 2 aspects. The claim that only material things exist. This has, first, the positive aspect that material things exist, and second, the negative aspect that nothing else exists apart from material things. Material things exist, and nothing else exists apart from material things. Thus, existence is granted to sticks and stones, and denial of souls, spirits, heaven, hell, and the possibility of an afterlife. So materialism is an answer to the metaphysical question, what exists, or what is reality like? The materialist said what exists is physical stuff, physical things, biological organisms, inorganic matter, other objects, things, entities which don't fit into that category, gods, goddesses, the god, souls, spirits, all of that stuff doesn't exist. Why doesn't it exist? Because only material things exist. So Sheldrake claims that science, starting in the early modern period, was committed to this idea of materialism. And this is where we get the view of the clockwork universe. And he's kind of right about framing it in that way, because you see this as an example in early physics, as well as early as well as early physiology and early biology. So if you look at, for example, early medical doctors of the Enlightenment period, such as William Harvey, when they're explaining how the body works, they're talking about the body in terms of a machine. And that the idea is that the body operates like any other machine operates, and that when we have a problem with the body, it's the same reason why you have a problem in one of these industrial machines, because a part of it got broken or something's out of sorts. Isaac Newton, when he talks about the nature and structure of the universe, will use the clock as an analogy, that the universe operates. And when I say clock, I'm not talking about like the digital clock that we're used to. I'm talking about the mechanical clock with the gears, that the universe operates in the same way that the mechanical clock operates, in the sense that there's all these moving parts. So you can think about the planets rotating around the sun. You could talk about each one of those individual gears and how those individual gears operate and rotate. And when you take it as together, you can kind of piece by piece kind of build up and construct the universe. As I've said several times now, Sheldrake says that this analogy is inherently misleading. This idea that science can be misled by analogies or images is not something that's unique to Sheldrake. I mean, philosophers have been talking about this for quite some time. The philosopher that I study and specialize this, philosopher named Gaston Bachelard, actually wrote an entire book about this in the early 20th century called The Formation of the Scientific Mind, and in which Bachelard says that scientific investigation, when we go to investigate nature, that we're presented with certain epistemological obstacles, that there are certain things which intellectually hinder humans in their investigation into nature, some of which seem like they shouldn't, such as the very first obstacle that, according to Bachelard, that hinders scientific investigation is actually the appearance of physical reality. That sounds odd, right? Because isn't science supposed to be based off of empiricism? Isn't science supposed to be based off of observation? Yes, but strictly interpreting. But Bachelard's point here is that our experience of reality is kind of filtered through the lens of interpretation. And most importantly, oftentimes what science reveals to us about nature is at odds with our experience. It's counterintuitive to us. So think, for example, the major theories of physics of the 20th century, the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. There's nothing intuitive about quantum mechanics. And our appearance of reality, if we apply that to quantum mechanics, could mislead us, because there's things that happen at a quantum level that don't happen at our level, so to speak. Right? So according to Bachelard, there are certain obstacles that we have to get past in order to do science, one of which being physical appearances. But Bachelard also identifies analogies and metaphors as an obstacle to scientific progress. And in this sense, Sheldrake's would be in good company here with Bachelard. Bachelard says that a science that accepts images that can be misleading, more than any other, is a victim of metaphors. Hence, the scientific mind must continuously fight against images, against analogies, against metaphors. So, speaking to Sheldrake's point here, what's the problem with the mechanistic understanding of the universe? I think we have a good contemporary example of that in comparisons that I oftentimes hear people make of, let's go back to human physiology, specifically consciousness. A common comparison and metaphor that you hear is that the brain is like a computer. Now, that might be the issues with metaphors and analogies, is that they always break down at some point. The other issue is, depending upon how strictly you interpret that metaphor, it could be very misleading. So, for example, there are some parallels between the brain and the computer that use the same language, such as memory, right? A computer has memory, and we have memory in our brain. The mistake would be to assume that memory in both of those instances operates and functions the same way. The problem is that it doesn't. right? If I save a file, like I'm going to go back later and save and edit this video, once I save this video file on my computer, I can pull it up a couple of hours after I record this. I can pull it up 2 months after I record this, but when I go to retrieve the file, it's going to be this, assuming that it's not corrupted or anything, it's going to be the exact same file that I recorded. But that's not how our memory works. When we remember a past event, memory within the brain is a more organic, dynamic process. As you are well aware of, our memories of past events change. They can be altered. We can be influenced in our remembering of a past event, and the meaning of those events oftentimes changes significance to us over the course of our lifetime. Memory within the context of the human being is a malleable thing. It's a changeable thing. And this is what Bachelard's highlighting about analogies. Yes, analogies can be useful to us, especially in helping us to understand something, but they can also be very misleading, and they can especially be misleading to our understanding of science. I have undergone a wardrobe change. That is because in the original video that I recorded was a previous day, and I live in the American South. It's currently pollen season, and my sinuses are going haywire. So I had to stop the video so many times because of my runny nose and sneezing. So I just called it off and wanted to pick up where we left off. So last time I was talking about this idea that Sheldrake's putting forward, which is this notion that scientific dogma, a specific type of scientific dogma, is impeding or holding back scientific progress or scientific research into particular areas. That general sentiment I was tending to agree with. There's this idea that some scientists have, and some philosophers too, people in general, I should say, that science ought to be free from philosophical baggage or philosophical claims. And practically speaking, that is most oftentimes just not the case. People very commonly derive philosophical ideas and principles from scientific ideas. There's a philosopher named Daniel Dennett who has this famous saying that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science, that the two kind of go hand in hand. And if there are philosophical concepts within scientific ideas, there's this possibility that we could be misled because of our philosophical predispositions to science and in our approach to science, which I think is one of the general points that Sheldrake is pointing out, that I would tend to agree with, that this, in fact, has happened and may continue to be happening. Where I'm going to take issue with is this idea, Sheldrake's emphasis, that it is materialism that is holding back science. And I think that this results from a fundamental misunderstanding between the difference between naturalism and materialism. So that's what I would like to focus on.
But there's a conflict in the heart of science between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or a worldview. And unfortunately, the worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the very lifeblood of the scientific endeavor. Since the late 19th century, science has been conducted under the aspect of a belief system or worldview, which is essentially that of materialism.
Just to re-emphasize the claim, this is from Sheldrake's TED Talk, and the idea here is that materialism is restricting scientific inquiry. I say that this is based on a fundamental mistake because I think that Sheldrake is confusing materialism with naturalism, specifically methodological naturalism. Because as he talks about in this video, there is indeed a method to scientific inquiry, but it's a specific type of inquiry, right? Science investigates the world in fundamentally different ways from other disciplines, such as mathematics or history, for example. History and mathematics are legitimate forms of inquiry, but there's different principles, different applications being utilized in their approach to the subject. And Sheldrake here is ignoring the fact that the scientific methodology is inherently naturalistic. So let me clarify these terms and why and where I think the confusion lies, and why this clarification is important. We first have this distinction between I want to make this distinction between methodological naturalism, ontological naturalism, and then what Sheldrake has identified as materialism. So methodological naturalism is, as the name suggests, a method of inquiry. And I think that science presupposes methodological naturalism for a reason. But this is what I mean by methodological naturalism. This is a quote taken from Judge Jones in actually from a court case, which is kind of odd. But the court case was involving the teaching of intelligent design in American public schools. But we have a nice little definition here. And this is what Judge Jones says. Expert testimony reveals that since the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, science has been limited to the search for natural causes to explain natural phenomenon. That's naturalism in a nutshell. Search for natural causes to explain natural phenomenon. While supernatural explanations may be important and have merit, they are not part of science. It is a ground rule that requires scientists to seek explanations in the world around us based on what we can observe, test, replicate, and verify. So naturalism, methodological naturalism as a tool, is an appeal. So what is science trying to do? Science is trying to explain the world around us. And the world around us is the world of stuff. I don't know why I pointed to a cup. It's the world of stuff, and it's an attempt to explain the observations that we see stuff doing, such as the Earth rotating around the sun, or an apple falling from a tree, or why my neighbor gets mad at me about how long my grass is. Right? It doesn't matter what we're attempting to explain. Naturalism is an attempt to explain that phenomenon by an appeal to natural causes. And why is this important? The reason why it's important is because science is not about the individual's experience or individual explanation. I have to provide an explanation to a group, to a community who has, and I have to appeal to a basis of evidence that's accessible to everybody. And the best way to do that, to ensure that everybody has access to the same explanation and to ensure that everybody can follow along with what I'm saying, is to appeal to evidence that is common, available to all people. So naturalism as a methodology seeks to explain phenomenon by appeal to natural causes. Why natural causes? Because natural causes, everybody experiences them. And they're verifiable, they're testable, not just for the individual, but for the group. So that's methodological naturalism. And as Judge Jones pointed out, science, since the beginning of the scientific revolution, has appealed to methodological naturalism and has subsequently assumed methodological naturalism in its practice, in the carrying out, in the doing of science. Why? This is the big question. Why methodological naturalism? And the answer to that is a very practical answer. It works. So why is Newton's theory of gravity, why did it gain such widespread popularity? Is because the mathematics that Newton employed to explain gravity were commonly available to anybody who wanted to understand it. Why did why did Darwin's theory of evolution worked? Because the evidence that Darwin's appealing to, which is a little bit more empirical, was laid out, was available, was accessible to anybody who wanted to explore Darwin's ideas. Methodological naturalism is assumed by science. Ontological naturalism, to throw another definition at you, and this is a quote from Carl Sagan: the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Ontological naturalism, very close to that definition that we talked about with respect to materialism, but ontological naturalism says that natural phenomenon and natural explanations is what there is. So ontological naturalism precludes supernatural explanations. And here I think Sheldrake is conflating the two. But what I want to emphasize is that materialism and naturalism are not the same thing. That science, I think, is first and foremost committed to methodological naturalism. And from that, some scientists and philosophers espouse ontological naturalism. That doesn't necessarily follow. And it also doesn't necessarily follow that we have to be committed, or that science is committed to a form of materialism, right? I think materialism's an oversimplification here, because there have been branches of science that were not inherently materialistic. And in fact, there still might be branches of science that aren't inherently materialistic. Because if we confine ourselves to matter, to physical stuff, what about those branches of science like quantum mechanics that deals with things that aren't matter in this sense, right? We're talking about elementary fundamental particles, the physical existence of which is not even needed, because we're dealing with the mathematical explanations. Okay, so Sheldrake's idea that it's materialism, I think, is a little is conflating this idea of naturalism. And the reason why I think I bring up this distinction and why I think it's important is because we have to understand the why science is committed to methodological naturalism and what the implications of that are. And I think this is best explained by a view known at, to throw another definition at you, I'm sorry, is explained by a view called provisional naturalism. As I explained before, methodological naturalism became the dominant scientific means of inquiry, largely because of how successful it is or was. So over time, what happened is that appeals to natural causes, natural explanations, became more and more popular and readily accessible at the exclusion of other explanations. But this is not to say that science is inherently committed to it, because supernatural explanations have been employed in science in the past, or at least appealed to. There's a lot of historical examples of this that I won't go into. I just want to read this brief quote to kind of explain the thought process of what's happening here. So pragmatic or provisional naturalism is an empirically grounded, committed to naturalistic causes and explanations, which in principle is revocable by extraordinary empirical evidence. And this is a quote from this academic article explaining it. According to this conception, and this is the important part I wanted to stress, methodological naturalism did not drop from thin air, but is just the best methodological guide that emerged from the history of science. So it was chosen because of its success, and it was emphasized because of its success. In particular, the pattern of constant success of naturalistic explanations. Appeals to the supernatural have consistently proven to be premature, and science has never made any headway by pursuing them. So I wanted to emphasize this to say that naturalism became the preferred method for a very practical, pragmatic reason, and that reason is because naturalistic explanations work. They work because they're available to everyone who wants to investigate them, and that this is why naturalistic explanations became the basis of science. Sheldrake's idea that materialism is holding science back because of this kind of dogmatic commitment to a philosophical idea ignores the fact that the scientific methodology itself is naturalistic, not inherently materialistic. All right. Well, I hope that kind of brief foray into Sheldrake's ideas was at least interesting. If you have any comments, feel free to leave the comment section of the video, and I will see you all later. Y'all have a good one.